I write this now, because I know what comes next. They don't tell you that in the final moments before the bolt round finds your skull, or the firing squad's lasguns light up the dawn, your mind becomes preternaturally clear. Every detail sharpens, every memory cuts like broken glass. I can see my hands as they move across this data slate, the trembling, the dirt beneath the nails that won't come clean, the chemical burns on my knuckles from 3 decades of crawling through promethium-soaked tank interiors. They shake not from fear anymore, but from muscle memory, from 10,000 hours gripping control levers, from the endless vibration of engines that never truly stop rumbling, even in silence. The cell is cold. They always are in these administratum detention blocks, carved from the bones of hive cities so old their foundations rest on the compressed remains of previous civilizations. The walls weep condensation that tastes of rust and old prayers. Somewhere above me, through kilometers of rockcrete and hab blocks stacked like grave markers, the planet's sun must be rising or setting, I've lost track of which. Time moves differently when you're waiting to be judged for surviving. My name is Matthias Kale, and I was a tank commander in the Astra Militarum for 32 years, 4 months, and 17 days. I know the exact count because the Monitorum knows, because every second of service is tallied, recorded, filed in triplicate, and stored in archives that will outlast the stars themselves. I commanded the Leman Russ battle tank designated Iron Witness, serial number 447 Theta 99 Kappa, assigned to the 88th Armored Regiment, 3rd Company, 7th Platoon. I remember every crew member who ever served under me. I remember their faces when they boarded, fresh and terrified or hardened and resigned. I remember how they looked when they died, all 47 of them across 3 decades of war. The Departamento Monitorum doesn't record those names with the same care they record serial numbers and ammunition expenditure. The dead are just logistics, another line item in the endless calculus of imperial warfare. The first crew I lost taught me what it meant to command. I was 24, barely promoted from gunner position, still carrying the arrogance of youth and the delusion that skill mattered more than fate. We called the tank Defiance, back then before I learned that naming your vehicle was like naming livestock before slaughter, an intimacy that only deepened the grief. We were deployed to a border world whose name I never learned, fighting an enemy whose features I can't recall through the fog of 3 decades and 100 campaigns. What I remember is the moment the crack missile punched through our side armor at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, that defied every training manual and tactical briefing. I remember the sound, not the explosion, but the moment before it, the sharp intake of breath from Corporal Venn in the driver's seat, as if he could sense the missile's approach through the meters of plasteel and ceramite, then light and heat and the smell of burning that I would never escape. I survived because I'd been leaning forward, checking the surveyor screen, my head positioned exactly where a pocket of air formed when the blast wave tore through the crew compartment. Physics and chance, nothing more. The Emperor's protection, they told me later. The chaplain's words dripping with sanctimony while my loader's blood still stained my uniform. Venn died instantly, his body compressed against the control mechanisms he'd operated with such precision. Trooper Callas, my gunner, survived long enough to scream for 40 seconds before the flames consumed his oxygen. The loader, a quiet youth whose name was Rem, was impaled by a fragment of our own ammunition rack and bled out while I tried to drag him from the wreckage with hands that kept slipping on blood and melted polymer coating. The radio operator never made a sound. The concussion had turned his brain to fluid inside his skull. They gave me a new crew 3 days later. No ceremony, no acknowledgement that 4 men had ceased to exist, except as entries in a casualty log. Just names and service numbers, and the expectation that I would continue because the alternative was unthinkable. The Imperium doesn't pause for grief. It doesn't recognize trauma as anything but weakness to be purged or exploited. I learned to stop flinching when new crew members introduced themselves, learned to see them as components, as temporary occupants of positions that would inevitably need refilling. The tank became a tomb on tracks, rolling forward through decades of war, collecting ghosts that whispered in the engine's rumble and manifested in the smell of ozone and sweat that never quite left the interior. The second crew lasted 8 months. We were deployed to a shrine world under attack by heretics, true believers, twisted by whispers from beyond reality's skin. They fought with the fervor of the damned and the tactical incompetence of zealots, which made them simultaneously less dangerous and more unpredictable than professional soldiers. We held a cathedral district for 72 days, our tank positioned at the intersection of 3 major arterial roads, firing until the barrels glowed and the air shimmered with heat haze. The crew worked with mechanical efficiency, each member knowing their role so perfectly that words became unnecessary. We communicated through the grammar of war, the clunk of shells loading, the whine of targeting servos, the shudder of recoil that traveled through the deck plates. They died from above. A fighter craft, marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, swooped low over our position during a resupply operation. We were exposed, vulnerable, the turret hatch open for ventilation because the heat inside had become unbearable. The pilot released their payload with precision, born of either skill or malevolent intelligence, I've never known which. The explosion vaporized my gunner, a veteran named Carr who had survived 6 campaigns before joining my crew. The driver lost both legs and most of his abdomen but remained conscious for 90 seconds, long enough to die looking at what remained of his body. The loader simply vanished, consumed by the fireball that briefly transformed our tank into a metal coffin filled with flame hot enough to warp the interior fittings. I was outside when it happened, checking the track assembly for damage. I watched through the open hatch as my crew burned, watched their silhouettes twist in the flames, their mouths open in screams I couldn't hear over the roar of combustion. The ammunition cooked off while I stood there, each explosion sending shrapnel whistling past my head, each detonation a judgment on my survival. The Medicae said I was fortunate. The Commissar said I was blessed. I said nothing because there were no words for what I felt, not grief anymore, but a hollow certainty that I had become a curse, a walking jinx that transformed metal and men into monuments of failure. The third crew arrived in a Munitorum transport, their uniforms still crisp, their faces still holding expressions that weren't quite resignation. They'd heard the stories by then. Tank crews gossip like any soldiers, and word spreads about commanders who lose men at rates that exceed standard attrition. They knew I was death in human form, but orders were orders, and the alternative to climbing into Iron Witness was execution for disobedience. So they climbed aboard, 3 new souls to feed the machine, and we rolled out to the next war because the Imperium's appetite for violence never diminishes. This crew taught me efficiency. We learned to operate with minimal communication, to read each other through the subtle shifts in the tank's movement, the rhythm of firing sequences, the way stress traveled through the metal frame. Trooper Vask drove with steady competence, never spectacular, but never failing. Gunner Helms had the gift of intuition, that rare ability to anticipate enemy movement and adjust targeting before confirmation came through the surveyor. Loader Quinn was fast, his hands moving in blur as he fed shells into the breach with metronomic precision. And the Vox operator, a thin woman named Ceres, maintained contact with command while simultaneously tracking 6 different combat channels and processing tactical data faster than most cogitators. They died on a winter world whose name translates roughly to penance. The irony wasn't lost on me even then. We were part of a massed armor assault, hundreds of tanks rolling across frozen plains toward enemy fortifications that bristled with anti-armor weaponry like the spines of some predatory beast. The cold was absolute, the kind that makes metal brittle and turns flesh numb within seconds of exposure. We fought in temperatures that made every mechanical action a gamble, every component a potential point of failure. The tank's interior became a paradox of extremes, freezing where the wind found gaps in the armor, scorching where the engine heat radiated through inadequate insulation. The attack failed in the way Imperial assaults often do, through attrition disguised as strategy, through the doctrine that acceptable casualties are merely a synonym for victory purchased with blood. We lost 60% of our armor in the first hour. The frozen ground couldn't absorb the energy of explosions properly, so each detonation sent shockwaves rippling across the battlefield, destabilizing formations and disorienting crews. I watched tanks explode like fireworks through the periscope, watched them brew up in gouts of flame that melted the ice beneath them, watched them simply stop moving as crew-killing munitions found their marks. We survived the initial assault. We survived the counterattack. We survived through skill and luck, and the simple mathematics that someone has to survive for the statistics to be meaningful. Then, during the withdrawal, a mine ancient, possibly dating back to previous wars on this emperor-forsaken rock, detonated beneath our left track assembly. The explosion was almost gentle by the standards I'd learned, more of a sharp crack than the thunderous blast I'd grown accustomed to, but it was enough. The track separated, links scattering across the ice like dropped prayer beads, and we lurched to a halt in the open, exposed, immobile. The enemy had forward observers. They always do. Within 30 seconds, artillery began finding our position. The first shells landed wide, sending up geysers of frozen earth and shattered ice. The second volley walked closer, each impact a calibration, a refinement of trajectory and timing. Ceres called for extraction while Quinn and Helms worked to repair the track, their hands clumsy in the cold, their breath forming clouds that froze instantly. Vask remained at the controls, ready to move the moment we regained mobility. I coordinated, directed, did everything a commander does when the universe decides your number has finally come up. The shell that killed them landed directly on the turret. I was outside, overseeing the repair work, standing in the exact wrong place to die. The blast threw me across the ice, spinning me like a discarded doll, breaking 3 ribs and my left arm, and filling my lungs with air so cold it burned. When I stopped rolling and managed to focus my eyes, the tank was gone. Not destroyed, gone. The turret had separated from the chassis. The crew compartment had been pulped into scrap, and where 4 human beings had existed seconds before, there was only metal, twisted into abstract shapes, and meat, rendered into component molecules. They sent me to a field hospital. They sent me to a Medicae facility. They sent me to therapy sessions with priests who spoke of the Emperor's plan and the nobility of sacrifice, while I stared at walls and said nothing, because what could possibly be said? The nightmares started then, though I suspect they'd always been waiting, just needed enough deaths to gain critical mass. I dreamed of crew compartments, filling with water or fire or blood, of hatches that wouldn't open, of voices screaming my name while I stood paralyzed, unable to help, unable to die with them as I should have. 6 months later, they assigned me a new crew and a new tank. Command doesn't waste experienced officers, even cursed ones. Especially cursed ones, perhaps, because we've learned all the lessons that keep us alive at the cost of everyone around us. The Leman Russ they gave me had been salvaged from a battlefield, its previous crew dead from causes the tech priests couldn't fully explain. The machine spirit was unsettled, they said, prone to minor malfunctions and inexplicable power fluctuations. I looked at the designation painted on its hull, Iron Witness, and understood with crystalline clarity that I had been given a vehicle whose nature matched my own, a survivor that collected deaths like other machines collected battle honors. This crew was different. They were older, veterans who'd survived long enough to develop the gallows humor and fatalistic calm that marked soldiers who'd accepted their mortality. Driver Korith had been driving tanks for 15 years, his body permanently bent from decades hunched over controls. Gunner Magos, no relation to the tech priests. Just an unfortunate name, could thread needle shots through gaps in enemy armor that shouldn't have been possible. Loader Frex had arms like hydraulic pistons and the endurance of a servitor. The Vox operator, Than, had been wounded so many times that his body was more scar tissue than original flesh, a patchwork of Medicae intervention and stubborn refusal to die. We fought together for 3 years. 3 years of grinding combat across a dozen worlds, of battles that blurred together into a continuous stream of violence and survival. We became a crew in the truest sense, not just soldiers occupying the same space, but a single organism spread across 5 bodies, thinking and reacting as one. We developed rituals, small superstitions that probably meant nothing but felt like control in a universe of chaos. Koreth would tap the control panel 3 times before starting the engine. Magos would whisper a prayer to the Emperor before each engagement. Frex would mark each shell with a tiny aquila before loading it. Than would hum hymns under his breath while monitoring Vox channels. They died the way I should have died a dozen times before. Suddenly. Absolutely. Without warning or mercy. We were supporting infantry during an urban assault, grinding through the ruins of a hive city whose original purpose had been lost to time and fire. The buildings were corpses of architecture, hollow shells that groaned in the wind and shed rubble like old skin. We moved carefully, aware that every corner held potential ambush. Every shadow might conceal enemy infantry with tank-hunting weapons. The anti-tank team was positioned 5 stories up, concealed in the skeleton of what had once been a commercial tower. They waited with the patience of hunters who understand that rushing guarantees failure. They waited until we'd passed beneath them, until our thinnest armor was exposed, until the geometry of angles and armor penetration values aligned in their favor. The missile entered through the top deck, punched through the engine compartment, and detonated inside the crew section with the efficiency of a perfectly executed execution. I felt the impact through the command seat, felt the shudder that meant catastrophic damage, felt the heat that preceded the fireball. Training took over. I hit the emergency hatch release, pulled myself through the opening with strength born of terror and muscle memory, rolled off the tank's hull and onto the rubble-strewn street. Behind me, Iron Witness died. The ammunition cooked off in a sustained detonation that lasted nearly a minute, each shell adding its voice to the symphony of destruction. Through the noise, I heard nothing from inside the tank. No screams, no calls for help. The missile had done its work too well. The infantry pulled me back, dragged me to cover while I fought them, trying to return to the burning wreck because surely someone had survived. Surely this time wouldn't be like all the others. But it was. It always was. When the fires finally died and the recovery teams examined the wreckage, they found 4 bodies so thoroughly destroyed that identification required genetic sampling and cross-referencing with Munitorum databases. 4 more names added to the list. 4 more ghosts to haunt my sleep. They didn't give me another crew. Instead, I received orders to report to a Departamento Munitorum facility for evaluation and reassignment. I traveled there in a transport alongside other damaged soldiers, men and women, who'd broken in ways too subtle for the Medicae to fix, who carried their wounds internally where no surgery could excise them. We didn't speak to each other. There was nothing to say. We recognized each other the way survivors always do, through the look in our eyes and the way we startled at sudden sounds. The facility was built into the side of a hive city, carved from rock and reinforced with architecture that suggested both fortress and prison. I waited in processing chambers for hours, then days, moving through a bureaucratic labyrinth designed to strip away identity and reduce humans to data points. I filled out forms that asked questions about my service record, my psychological state, my willingness to continue serving the Emperor's will. I answered honestly because lying seemed pointless. Yes, I had nightmares. Yes, I questioned my fitness for command. Yes, I had lost multiple crews under circumstances that might suggest incompetence or worse. The interrogation came on the 5th day. 3 officers, none of whom identified themselves beyond rank, sat behind a plasteel table in a room that smelled of disinfectant and old fear. They asked me to recount each crew's death, to describe in detail the circumstances and my actions leading up to each incident. I spoke for 6 hours, my voice growing hoarse, my throat raw from the recycled air and the effort of dredging up memories I'd spent years trying to bury. They took notes on data slates, their faces impassive, their questions clinical and precise. When I finished, they conferred in whispers too quiet to overhear, then dismissed me to my quarters, a cell, really, though they called it accommodation. I sat on the narrow cot and stared at the walls while the implications settled over me like a burial shroud. I'd been a tank commander for 32 years, had served with distinction through campaigns that would have broken lesser soldiers, and now I faced judgment not for cowardice or disobedience, but for the simple crime of survival. In the Imperium, living when others die is suspicious. Patterns of survival suggest either exceptional skill or something worse: cowardice, treachery, or the taint of forces that lie beyond approved doctrine. The second interrogation came 3 days later. This time, only one officer attended, a woman whose uniform bore symbols I didn't recognize, whose eyes held the flat certainty of someone who'd seen enough to stop being surprised by anything. She asked different questions. Did I believe the Emperor protected me? Did I think I deserved to survive when so many others didn't? Had I ever experienced moments of prescient knowledge, of knowing what would happen before it did? Had I noticed any unusual phenomena around me, equipment malfunctions, unexplained luck, voices in the static of Vox channels? I understood then what they suspected. In the Imperium, survival itself can be evidence of heresy. The logic is simple. If you live when others die, either you're blessed by the Emperor or cursed by his enemies. And if you're blessed, why do those around you keep dying? The math doesn't work. The pattern suggests something else, something that requires investigation by those trained to identify corruption before it metastasizes into full-blown chaos worship or psychomanifestation. I told her the truth, because lies would only confirm their suspicions. No, I didn't believe I was blessed. No, I'd never heard voices or experienced visions. Yes, I understood that my survival was statistically improbable, but probability isn't evidence of supernatural intervention. Sometimes dice just fall in your favor, even when you wish they wouldn't. Sometimes the shell lands 3 meters to the left instead of center mass. Sometimes you're looking at the surveyor screen when the missile hits. Sometimes you survive. She made notes, asked follow-up questions that circled the same territory from different angles, probing for inconsistencies or revelations. After 4 hours, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the detached interest of a medicae examining a particularly unusual specimen. Then she told me I was being reassigned, not to another tank, not to another regiment. Instead, I would serve as an instructor at a training facility, teaching new crews the skills they'd need to survive on the battlefield. The irony was so dense it had gravitational pull. I asked why. Why waste an experienced officer on training duty when the front lines always needed veteran commanders? She smiled, an expression devoid of warmth or humor, and explained that my experience was precisely why I'd be effective as an instructor. I knew what killed tank crews. I'd seen every mistake, every failure, every moment of bad luck or poor judgment that transformed metal coffins into literal graves. Who better to prepare young soldiers for the reality of armored warfare than someone who'd buried 47 crew members and lived to catalogue their deaths? The training facility sat on an agri-world, one of the breadbasket planets that fed the Imperium's endless hunger for resources. The landscape was flat to the horizon, broken only by grain silos and processing plants, the soil rich from millennia of corpse starch recycling and industrial fertilization. The base itself was functional in the way Imperial installations always are: ugly, efficient, built to minimum specifications with no concession to comfort or aesthetics. Barracks housed the trainees, rows of bunks in buildings that could have been warehouses or prisons depending on your perspective. I taught them everything. I taught them how to maintain track tension and monitor engine temperatures. I taught them to read terrain for ambush sites and natural kill zones. I taught them firing solutions and ammunition selection and the 100 small skills that separated effective crews from smoking wrecks. But mostly, I taught them that death was patient and creative and inevitable. That skill mattered, but luck mattered more. That the Emperor might protect, but protection looked a lot like random chance dressed in theological language. They didn't like me. Instructors are rarely loved, but I was something worse than strict or demanding. I was honest. I told them that most of them would die in their first engagement. I showed them casualty statistics the Munitorum didn't advertise, the real numbers that quantified just how quickly tank crews were consumed by Imperial warfare. I described in explicit detail how their friends would burn, how the inside of a penetrated tank became an oven or a pressure cooker, how death in armored combat was rarely quick or clean. The other instructors complained to our commanding officer. I was damaging morale, they said. I was filling young soldiers with fear that would make them hesitate in combat. I was undermining the Imperial Guard's effectiveness with my nihilistic fatalism. The colonel, a man who'd spent 40 years in the service and carried scars that mapped every campaign like a grotesque journal, called me to his office and asked me a single question. Was I lying? I told him no. Everything I taught was true, verifiable through Munitorum records and tactical analysis. The numbers didn't lie, even if the propaganda did. He studied me for a long moment, then dismissed the complaints with a wave of his augmetic hand. The truth might be uncomfortable, he said, but comfortable soldiers were dead soldiers. Better they learn fear in training than discover it when the first missile struck their armor. I taught there for 7 years. 7 years of watching young faces cycle through the facility, learning to crew tanks, learning to kill, learning to die. Some of them would survive their first engagement, most wouldn't. I stopped learning their names after the first year because names just made the statistics hurt more. They were cadets, trainees, students, roles they occupied briefly before graduating to their true purpose as ammunition for the Imperium's endless wars. I slept poorly. The nightmares had evolved, grown more sophisticated with each passing year. Now I dreamed of training grounds where the practice tanks were real, where the simulation ammunition was live, where cadets burned in training exercises that somehow became actual combat. I dreamed of standing in the instructor's tower while below me, tanks exploded in sequence. Each detonation a name I'd forgotten, each fireball a face I couldn't quite remember. I woke gasping, my sheets soaked with sweat that smelled of promethium and fear. The Medicaid prescribed sleeping aids that didn't work, and therapy sessions that addressed everything except the fundamental problem. I was alive when I shouldn't be, teaching others to survive when I couldn't protect my own crews. The cognitive dissonance was fracturing something inside me, creating fault lines in my sanity that widened with each graduating class. Each group of trainees who marched off to die in tanks, they'd learned to crew under my instruction. On the 7th anniversary of my assignment to the training facility, orders came through reassigning me to active duty. No explanation, no appeal process. The Imperium had decided it needed my experience on the front lines again, and the Imperium's needs were non-negotiable. I packed my few possessions uniforms, a data slate containing technical manuals I'd memorized years ago, and a small box of personal effects that consisted of nothing but crew rosters, names and service numbers of the dead, and reported to the transport depot. The new assignment was a penal legion, one of the punishment units where soldiers guilty of desertion, cowardice, or insubordination were sent to die redemptively for the Emperor. They needed tank crews and apparently decided that a cursed commander was appropriate for cursed soldiers. The logic was Imperial in its brutal efficiency. Put the broken with the damned and see who survives. The penal world they shipped us to was a place without redemption, a rock orbiting a star that glared down with the intensity of divine judgment. The heat was oppressive, even inside climate-controlled facilities. And outside it turned the ground to something that wasn't quite solid, a semi-molten surface that would support weight but radiated enough heat to cook flesh in prolonged exposure. The enemy was entrenched in fortifications built into the planet's spine, a mountain range that rose from the hellscape like broken teeth. My new crew consisted of soldiers who'd failed in spectacular ways. Driver Kess had fled during a charge, leaving his infantry to die without armor support. Gunner Vale had struck a superior officer during an argument about tactics. Loader Rin had been caught stealing rations from the regimental supply depot. Vox operator Chen had disobeyed a direct order, refusing to advance into what he correctly identified as a kill zone. His only crime was being right when his commanding officer was wrong. They expected me to punish them, to add to the abuse they'd already endured from the penal system. Instead, I taught them the same things I'd taught the cadets: how to survive, how to kill efficiently, how to read a battlefield and exploit every advantage. I didn't care about their crimes. In the Imperium, almost everyone was guilty of something. What mattered was whether they could function as a crew, whether they could transform their collective shame and fear and anger into effective violence. We fought for 6 months in that hell. 6 months of grinding assaults against fortifications that seemed impregnable, of watching other tanks die in droves, of surviving through skill and luck, and the simple fact that even random chance occasionally favors the unworthy. This crew was different from my previous assignments. They fought with the desperation of the condemned, with nothing to lose because everything had already been taken. They were efficient because inefficiency meant death, and while they were all marked for death anyway, they seemed determined to die on their own terms rather than the Imperium schedule. Kess drove like a man possessed, threading the tank through terrain that should have been impassable, finding routes that kept us alive when exposure meant certain destruction. Vale's gunnery was inspired by rage, each shot placed with precision born of anger refined into art. Rin loaded with mechanical perfection, his hands moving faster than conscious thought. Chen kept us connected to the broader battle while simultaneously identifying threats before they materialized, his criminal instincts translating perfectly into tactical awareness. I started to hope. Emperor, forgive me. I started to believe that maybe this time would be different, that this crew would break the pattern, that these damned souls might earn their redemption through survival rather than glorious death. We completed missions that should have killed us. We survived engagements where the tactical doctrine called for our annihilation. We became, against all probability, an effective fighting unit that command actually began to rely on. The end came during what should have been a routine patrol. We were checking supply routes in the rear areas, far from the main combat zones, the kind of assignment that usually meant safety. The ambush was perfectly executed, a level of coordination that suggested either enemy special forces or something worse. They hit us with multiple anti-tank weapons simultaneously, targeting not our armor but our tracks, immobilizing us in a crossfire position where every angle exposed a vulnerability. I gave the order to abandon vehicle. There was no shame in it, the tank was dead, we just needed to leave before it became our coffin too. But Kess couldn't get his hatch open. Something had warped in the ambush, jamming the mechanism, trapping him in the driver's compartment. Vale and Rin tried to help, working from outside while I coordinated, while Chen called for emergency extraction that we all knew wouldn't arrive in time. The enemy closed in. Not quickly, they had time, and they knew it. I could hear their voices, not words but tone, the sound of soldiers who'd caught their prey and were savoring the moment before the kill. I made a decision then, one I've replayed 10,000 times in the years since. I ordered Vale, Rin, and Chen to scatter, to escape while they could, while the enemy focused on the tank. They hesitated. Vale actually refused, said they wouldn't abandon Kess or me. I pulled rank, screamed at them that it was a direct order, that dying together was pointless, that survival meant someone would remember. They ran. I stayed with Kess, working at the jammed hatch while enemy fire crept closer, while the sounds of pursuit echoed off the rocks. Kess looked at me through the periscope, his eyes meeting mine, and in that moment, I saw acceptance. He'd known since his crime that redemption meant death. He'd just hoped it would be on his own terms, not trapped in a metal box while the universe closed in. The grenade that ended it came through the open turret hatch. I saw it arc through the air, watched it bounce off the interior plating, recognized what it was with the clarity of long experience. I had perhaps 2 seconds to react. I could have thrown myself clear, could have added one more survival to my tally of improbable escapes. Instead, I threw myself over the hatch, covering Kess's position, trying somehow to shield him from the blast I knew would kill us both. The explosion was everything and nothing. light and heat and pressure, and then darkness so absolute it seemed to have physical weight. I woke in a Medicae facility days later, my body held together by augmetics and chemical therapy, and machines that breathed for me while my lungs relearned their function. Kess was dead. Vale, Rin, and Chen were listed as missing, presumed dead, hunted down during their escape by enemy forces that gave no quarter to Imperial soldiers. The investigation took 3 months. They examined every detail of the ambush, interviewed survivors from other units, analyzed tactical data and Vox recordings. In the end, they concluded what I already knew. I had failed again. My decision to stay with Kess had been noble, but tactically unsound. My order for the others to scatter had broken unit cohesion and likely contributed to their deaths. I had violated multiple doctrinal principles and acted against the best interests of the Imperial Guard's operational efficiency. But I had also survived. Again. Against probability. Against reasonable expectation. Against the apparent will of the universe itself. The Medicae said, my survival was miraculous. The grenade had detonated less than a meter from my position, and I should have been liquefied. Instead, I'd been shielded by some combination of angle and armor fragments and blind luck that left me catastrophically injured but technically alive. They brought me here, to this detention facility, to await judgment. The charges are complex. Dereliction of duty, tactical incompetence, suspicion of cowardice despite evidence of the opposite, and the nameless crime of surviving too often. In the Imperium, patterns that can't be explained through doctrine or divine intervention are evidence of something wrong, something corrupt, something that needs to be purged before it spreads. I understand their logic. I've commanded too many crews, lost too many soldiers, survived too many engagements that should have killed me. At some point, statistical improbability becomes evidence of malign influence. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am cursed, or tainted, or touched by forces I don't understand. Maybe the Emperor has rejected me, and that rejection manifests as a bubble of death that consumes everyone around me while leaving me grotesquely intact. Or maybe I'm just unlucky in the way that keeps you breathing when breathing becomes punishment. Maybe survival is its own form of damnation. And every morning I wake is another day in a sentence that won't end until the Imperium decides I've suffered enough. The cell door is opening now. I can hear boots on stone, multiple sets, the measured tread of soldiers escorting someone to their fate. I'm not afraid. Fear requires the belief that things could be otherwise, and I lost that decades ago. I've been dying by degrees for 32 years, each lost crew taking another piece of whatever made me human. What's left isn't worth preserving. They'll probably shoot me. That's the usual punishment for officers whose records show patterns the commissariat can't explain. A bolt round to the back of the head, a brief flare of pain, and then nothing. Or maybe they'll be creative. The Imperium has many ways of punishing those who fail its expectations. Penal legions, penitent crusades, surgical transformation into servitors who can't remember they were once human. I hope they shoot me. I hope it's quick and final and absolute. I hope there's nothing after, no Emperor's judgment, no eternal service in death. I hope I simply stop, that consciousness ends like a Vox channel going dead, that the universe forgets I existed with the same casual indifference it showed when my crews died. But I don't think they'll show me that mercy. I think they have other plans. Plans that involve extracting every last measure of use from a resource the Imperium invested decades in training. I think my punishment will be to continue, to serve in some capacity that ensures I can never command again, but can't escape the machinery of Imperial warfare. I think they'll find a way to keep me alive and suffering because that's what the Imperium does best. It transforms humans into tools, and tools into weapons, and weapons into monuments to its own endless hunger for violence. The guards are at my cell now. I can see them through the narrow window in the door, their faces hidden behind helmets, their weapons ready though. I'm no threat to anyone but myself. Behind them stands a figure in a uniform I recognize: commissariat. The political officers who maintain discipline through fear and summary execution. He's here to render judgment or deliver it himself, and I find I don't care which. The door opens. The commissar steps inside, his features hard and cold as the cell's walls. He doesn't speak immediately, just studies me the way I've studied battlefields, looking for weakness or advantage or understanding. Then he tells me that the Departamento Munitorum has reviewed my case and reached a decision. I'm being reassigned, not to execution, not to a penal legion, but back to training duty. They've determined that my survival isn't evidence of corruption but of exceptional skill, combined with improbable luck. The loss of crews is unfortunate but statistically within acceptable ranges given the casualty rates of armored warfare. I'm too valuable an asset to waste, too experienced to discard. I'll train new tank commanders now, teach them not just how to operate their vehicles, but how to lead, how to make the decisions that will get their crews killed, how to live with the weight of responsibility that crushes everyone who carries it long enough. I'll share my experience, my accumulated knowledge of what kills tank crews and how to minimize, never eliminate, only minimize those deaths. I laugh. I can't help it. The sound echoes off the stone walls, bouncing back at me distorted, unfamiliar. The commissar's expression doesn't change. He's seen worse reactions to judgment, witnessed soldiers break down or rage or beg. My laughter probably registers as hysteria, as a mind cracking under pressure. He's not wrong. He leaves without another word, and the guards escort me out of the cell, through corridors that smell of industrial cleaner and human despair, up through levels of the detention facility until we emerge into daylight that makes my eyes water after days in darkness. A transport is waiting, engine idling, ready to carry me to whatever training facility needs a broken commander to shape the next generation of soldiers who will die in tanks that can't protect them. I climb aboard because refusing is pointless, because I've spent 32 years following orders, even when those orders led to death and failure and grief so deep it has its own gravity. The transport pulls away, and through the narrow window I watch the detention facility recede. Watch it shrink until it's just another building in a hive city of billions, another small piece of the Imperium's vast machinery of control and violence. I write this final entry knowing it will never be read, knowing that even if it is, it won't matter. The Imperium doesn't care about individual suffering or personal guilt or the nightmares that wake you screaming in the night. It cares about utility, about extracting maximum value from its resources, about transforming humans into components of a war machine so vast that individual deaths are less than rounding errors in its calculations. I'll teach them. I'll teach them everything I know, all the skills and tactics and bitter wisdom I've accumulated through 3 decades and 47 dead crew members. I'll teach them knowing that most will die in their first engagement, that my knowledge will buy them maybe a few extra minutes of life before the missile finds them, or the ambush springs, or simple bad luck transforms their tank into a metal coffin. And maybe, if there's any mercy in the universe, though I've seen no evidence it exists, maybe one of them will survive. Maybe one will learn enough, be lucky enough, be skilled enough to avoid the fate that consumed everyone I commanded. Maybe they'll live long enough to become what I am, a monument to survival purchased at the cost of everyone around you, a walking testimony to the brutal calculus of imperial warfare. Or maybe they'll all die, and I'll continue, adding their names to the list I carry, the roster of the dead that grows heavier with each passing year, until it weighs more than any physical burden. Maybe that's my true punishment, not death, which would be mercy, but endless life spent cataloging the cost of service to an Imperium that devours its servants without pause or gratitude. The transport rumbles on through the hive city, past hab blocks stacked like graves, past factories that forge the weapons of war, past shrines where citizens pray to an emperor who doesn't answer because he's too busy dying slowly on a throne of gold and lies. I close my eyes and see them all, Ven and Callus and Rem, Carr and his burning crew, Vask and Helms and Quinn and Ceres, Koreth and Magos and Frex and Than, Kess and Vale and Rin and Chen. 47 faces, 47 names, 47 ghosts that ride with me in every vehicle, that whisper in every engine rumble, that manifest in every mechanical sound that resembles human suffering. I failed them all. I led them to their deaths through incompetence or bad luck, or the simple fact that the universe doesn't care about skill or dedication, or the desperate hope that this time might be different. And now I'll teach others to fail in the same ways, to make the same mistakes, to carry the same unbearable weight of command that transforms soldiers into monsters who can't sleep because their dreams are graveyards. The training facility appears on the horizon, sprawling across the landscape like a scar on the planet's surface. This is my future, my punishment disguised as continued service, teaching the damned to damn others, preparing the dead to be for their inevitable fate, transforming humans into ammunition for a war machine that never stops consuming and never achieves victory, because victory would mean the end of its purpose. I should feel something. Despair or anger, or even relief that at least I won't be directly responsible for more deaths. But I feel nothing. That part of me died years ago, buried under the accumulated weight of failed command and survivor's guilt, so profound it has become my entire identity. What remains is just a machine, Imperial made, designed to continue functioning until it can't, to serve until service kills it, to bear witness to atrocity, until witnessing becomes complicity, becomes collaboration, in the endless horror of existence under the Imperium's rule. The transport stops. The guards gesture for me to disembark. I step out into air that tastes of promethium and recycled atmosphere, into light that seems somehow wrong, too bright or too dim, reality refusing to conform to my perception. The facility gates stand open, waiting to swallow me, waiting to begin the next phase of a punishment that has no end, because ending would require the Imperium to acknowledge that some costs are too high, some services extract too much. Some survival is its own form of damnation. I walk forward, because forward is the only direction the Imperium allows. Behind me, a trail of 47 ghosts follows, invisible to everyone but me, their whispers merging with the sound of distant engines and machinery that never stops, never rests, never acknowledges the humanity it consumes in its operation. Ahead lies more of the same, more teaching, more training, more preparing of soldiers who will die in tanks I've taught them to crew, more names to add to the endless roster of the dead I carry like a burden that grows heavier with each step, but never quite becomes heavy enough to stop me. This is my life now. This is my punishment. This is what survival means in the Imperium of man, not death, which would be simple, but endless continuation, endless service, endless witness to the machinery of war that transforms humans into components, and components into corpses, and corpses into statistics that justify the next campaign, the next war, the next generation of soldiers who will learn to die efficiently under commanders who couldn't save their crews and can't save themselves. I am Matthias Kale. I was a tank commander. I lost 47 crew members over 32 years of service, and now I will teach others to do the same, to fail in the same ways, to carry the same weight until it crushes them or transforms them into something that can bear it, something that isn't quite human anymore but still serves, because service is all the Imperium allows, all it acknowledges, all it rewards, with continued breath and continued suffering, and the cold certainty that your sacrifice means nothing except as data in endless reports that no one reads and no one cares about, because in the Imperium, everyone is expendable, and survival is just another form of failure. The gates close behind me. The training facility swallows me, and somewhere, in some other part of the galaxy, new crew members are boarding tanks for the first time, learning controls and procedures and the 100 skills that will keep them alive for minutes or hours, or, if they're very lucky and very unlucky, years. And they'll die. Most of them will die. And their commanders will survive, will carry their names like I carry mine, will teach the next generation the same lessons that don't matter because teaching can't overcome the mathematics of imperial warfare, can't change the fundamental equation that values ammunition over human life, firepower over survival, Victory at any cost over the recognition that some costs are too high to be justified by any doctrine or any faith or any empire that calls itself eternal while feeding on the souls of its servants. I have nothing left to write. No insights remain, no wisdom to share, no hope to offer. Only this: the Imperium survives by consuming its servants. And I am just another meal in an endless feast, another component in a machine so vast that individual suffering disappears into its operation like screams into the void. I survived 47 crew deaths, and I will survive more, teaching and training and preparing soldiers for deaths I can't prevent. Deaths that are inevitable and necessary and meaningless all at once, deaths that serve no purpose except to feed the machine that grinds on without pause or mercy, or any acknowledgement that the cost might someday become too high to bear. But the cost is never too high. That's what I've learned. That's what 32 years of service has taught me. The Imperium will extract every measure of value from every resource. Will push every soldier until they break and then find use for the broken pieces. Will continue until the last star dies and the last human screams, and there's nothing left but darkness and the fading echo of prayers offered to an emperor who stopped listening millennia ago, if he ever listened at all. I am Iron Witness. I am the survivor. I am the commander who couldn't save his crews and can't save himself. And I will teach, because teaching is all I have left, all the Imperium allows, all that remains when everything else has been stripped away by years of service and seas of blood, and the grinding weight of responsibility that transforms humans into monuments to their own failures. This is my confession. This is my testimony. This is what survival means in the Imperium of man.